You're listening to episode 120, Rediscovering Your Sense of Self After Emotional Abuse, with Carol Ann Marshall. Welcome to the Grass Gets Greener podcast, the show for survivors by survivors. I'm your host, Melissa Wilson, a bullying survivor and anti-bullying advocate. And each week you'll hear from a survivor who has overcome a traumatic experience to go on to not only survive, but thrive, so that you can too, starting now. Hey there, welcome, and thank you for joining me for this episode of the podcast. I'm glad to have you here. And today we're going to be joined by Carol Ann Marshall, author of I Dare You, Conquer Fear, and Free Yourself from Emotional Abuse. Carol Ann is on a mission to help women heal from emotionally abusive relationships after experiencing the effects of this type of abuse firsthand. And she'll share her personal story with us, along with the things that have helped her to heal. And she's also going to talk about how her upbringing played a part in the relationship she ended up in. Now, while we talk about this topic in relation to women, of course, men can be affected by this type of abuse as well. So if you're a guy who's listening and you think you might be experiencing emotional abuse, then please check this episode out. Or if you know of a woman who is going through this, then please feel free to share this with her. Now, before we get into it, let me tell you a little more about what we talk about in this episode. Carol Ann is going to share with us what emotional abuse is and what it looks like exactly, how emotional abuse and physical abuse can go hand in hand, the ways in which emotional abuse can affect someone, why it's hard for women to speak out if they're being emotionally abused. Carol Ann will share how she was able to get out of her abusive relationships, but she'll also talk about why it's difficult to leave an emotionally abusive relationship and what leads to the pattern of going from one abusive relationship to another. She'll share with us the story of how her book came to be, and we'll also talk about the importance of putting yourself first sometimes and feeling okay with that. And just lots of other great information that Carol Ann has to share with us in regards to the topic of emotional abuse. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this one, and I'll go bring Carol Ann on. Carol Ann, welcome to the podcast, and thank you for joining me here today to share your story with us.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you here. So you and I got connected through a mutual contact, Jesse Krieger of Lifestyle Entrepreneurs Press, and Jesse's company is publishing your newest book. It's called I Dare You, Conquer Fear, and Free Yourself from Emotional Abuse. And Jesse thought that you'd be a great guest for the show, and I'm glad he made the connection because I know you have an important message that you're trying to get out there, and I think it's one that can be beneficial to my listeners, particularly women who are in abusive situations. And my audience, they come from different types of abusive backgrounds. And today we're going to talk more about emotional abuse, which I know you think is a type of abuse that isn't being talked about enough, but that it needs to be, because the scars from it are just as real as physical ones. And you describe emotional abuse as the mental control of another by the systematic undermining of that person's self-confidence, self-esteem, and sense of self. And, as someone who was bullied growing up, I can definitely identify with that and can attest to how harmful that can be. Now, I know that your story is more about emotional abuse from relationships you've had as an adult, but what's interesting is, you're going to talk about how it was just the culture that you were raised in and the beliefs that you formed that led you to getting into these types of relationships. So I definitely want to, explore that today because I think your story and what you've learned along the way is going to be helpful to not only someone who is in an abusive relationship right now as an adult, but to someone who is growing up in an environment that is kind of setting them up for these types of relationships down the line. And maybe we can help them, break free of that now and save them some pain. So, Carol Ann, tell us what your life was like growing up and how that, played into what you experienced later on as an adult.
Yeah, thanks. I grew up in the Caribbean. I grew up on a small island, and it was very closed in many respects. The island was my world. As a child, it was really important to me to be perfect in that I didn't want to embarrass my parents. I didn't want to do anything that would make me look small or look bad in their lives, and also at school and at church. So it wasn't just the family setting, it was the culture as a whole, because at school, we were taught to be seen and not heard. So if you wanted to say something, you put your hand up. You didn't talk out of turn. The same thing at church. You were supposed to be very quiet and peaceful. So as a child, I learned how to be quiet and do what I was told, and also to be as perfect as I possibly could. So, and that also meant being the kind of person that pleased everyone. So in order to be loved and to be liked, I felt that I needed to please everyone. And that's dangerous because you don't notice it so much as a child, but it really does have significant effect on you as you grow older, get into relationships, because then you start to please the person you're in a relationship with. And this type of symptoms that I have noticed are the underpinnings of emotional abuse. Those symptoms are not things that we would think of as destructive, because we're just pleasing and we're accepting and absorbing every single thing that that person has done. And if it's something that we don't feel comfortable with, we do things to eventually make ourselves comfortable with it. So
what are like some of the symptoms that maybe we're not aware of?
For example, if a person is saying, a guy is saying to you, and let me use my personal experiences, telling you you don't know how to drive. I was a police officer for 6 years. I know how to drive, but my partner would stand up, get out of the car, and order me how to back up the car, how to park by backing into it. I know how to do that. Also, things like saying nasty things about your relatives and your friends, that starts to isolate you. And then you have nobody to turn to. So eventually that person then becomes the only person that's in your life. So if you've got an issue, you've got a problem, or you've got a challenge, there's nobody to talk to. It's just that person. And an example.
You've become isolated.
Yeah, incredibly isolated, because I was listening constantly to very negative things about my family. And my brother and I are very close because we grew up like twins. We are a year apart. And this constant negative comment about him, negative comments about my friends, it weighs you down. Also,
do you start to like believe them after a while too?
Yeah, you do.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. It drips into your brain. And I think that's part of the insidious nature of emotional abuse, is that you don't really notice it. It's just one thing after another that eventually gets into your brain. And by the time you realize, it's so far down the road, you're walking on eggshells because you don't know what this person is going to do. And also, every single thing you do as well is there's anger. He's angry at everything you do. You don't know what to do, because if you say something, you don't know if he's going to be angry about it. If you talk about something that's happening in the news, there's going to be an argument. Every single thing is an argument. So eventually there's no comfort, to the point where I didn't even want to come home from work. Work was not that great, but I did not want to come home.
Mm-hmm.
I had to, but I didn't want to.
Right, so it's not the type of environment that makes you feel good.
No. And then gradually he started throwing small things at me, like balled up paper. At one point, I had my glasses on the desk, and he threw it on the desk, and the glasses went flying into the printer and knocked the lens out. And then it was a pen, and then it was a magazine. And at that point, I decided I need to leave. because the next thing he threw at me might have been something that would really injure or kill me.
Mm. Yeah, no, and you've talked about in your book how it can go from, emotional abuse to then physical abuse.
Right. And I honestly believe that physical abuse, by the time a relationship gets to the physical abuse stage, there's been emotional abuse that's been going on for a long time before that. Because for me, the two of them go hand in hand. They're not mutually exclusive. They go hand in hand. And also being told every time he was angry that it was what I did that made him angry. So that person never takes responsibility for any of the anger. It was always aimed at me. And at one point I said, I would like us to go to counseling. And he said, I'm not going to counseling, but I think you should go because then you'll learn how to communicate with me.
Mm.
And I thought, but we both need to go. And there was no point arguing because the argument was going to go nowhere. Mm-hmm. And that's the other thing too, that for me became a real challenge, is not wanting to say anything because it would escalate into an argument. So I just kept quiet, even though things that were said to me I didn't like, or things that were done I didn't like, decisions that were made in the household I didn't like, but I went along with it because to me that was safer than incurring any of the verbal abuse.
Mm. But then you lose your voice, you lose your identity.
That's for sure. You end up not knowing who you are. Mm-hmm. That's why I came up with that definition. For me, that's what emotional abuse is. It's someone mentally controlling you and then systematically doing the kinds of things to really damage your self-confidence and your self-esteem and the sense of really who you are as a person. Mm-hmm. And the horrible thing about emotional abuse as well is all of us wear a mask. We're two different people because we're out in the world and we're women who are bold and brave and we're assertive. Some of us are aggressive. But when we come home, it's a whole different story. One of the working titles for the book was Behind Closed Doors, mm-hmm. because it's two different people. And you have to be in many respects because I shouldn't say you have to be, but when you go outside, you don't want people to know that you're not in control of your own life, especially if you're in a job where you have a lot of authority. And as I mentioned in the book, one of my women who eventually spoke to me, because it was a really challenging exercise to get people to talk to me, was a high school principal for a number of years before she eventually escaped her abusive relationship. So it doesn't matter who you are. It can happen to anybody at any level of society. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I think of, let's say, for example, you're a wife of the top surgeon in your town or city. Of course, he has got a certain stature in society. Well known, everybody loves him. If you're being abused and you talk about it, who is going to believe you?
Right.
That's the challenge, is getting people to believe you, because people believe what they see. Mm-hmm. And you can't see it. It's like when people talk about being stressed. Nobody can see that but you. So you're this woman, and chances are you live in the best neighborhood in the city. He has got enough clout to say, how dare you talk about me abusing you, to take you to court, to have you declared crazy, to take away your kids if you have any, to throw you out of the house. Where are you going to go? So women in those situations will never talk about it because they're not going to go to a shelter. That's not who they are. So women tend to put up with emotional abuse for many reasons, and they see what's happening with in the press with women who complain or file charges against sexual and physical abuse that you can see. Why would they want to talk about emotional abuse? Nobody can see it and nobody's going to believe you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the problem.
So you really just end up kind of alone. You're dealing with it alone because you're wearing this mask on the outside because you don't want people to know what's going on. And then, you go home and you have to deal with that. And then at the same time, like you don't have anyone else to turn to talk to you about it. So you're dealing with it alone and you're not getting to be, who you truly are. And so it just makes for such a difficult situation to be in.
Yeah, exactly. And I found what was happening with me is I just started to close myself off.
Mm-hmm.
I started not to feel anything. I was really becoming quite numb. And I was going through the motions of living. I wasn't, it was at work. It was as if I was on autopilot. I did what I needed to do, and I'm hiding behind a facade because I'm all smiles and I'm joking and I'm having a great time at work, but I come home and none of that, that's not me. That's a whole different person.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm starting to think something's off here. This is not me.
And I think that's where those wounds really start to run deep.
Oh, yes. Because I'm sure most people have heard the term sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That's the biggest lie ever.
Definitely.
But because the words stay in your brain forever. You can even just ask an adult, tell me something that a teacher said to you that you still remember, negative, that you still remember today. And they can tell you in a heartbeat. Mm-hmm. So the things that happen to you that people constantly reinforce in your brain, you'll never forget. A broken bone might heal, or a broken bone will take you into a hospital. A doctor will see you. You may have a cast. So somebody will know that something's happened. Nobody knows what's happened because it's happening in your head. Mm-hmm. And that's the danger of emotional abuse. I didn't tell anybody. None of my friends knew. And this was the third relationship. Nobody knew until it got to the point where I've eventually had to tell a really close friend. And I said, I can't stand this anymore. I need to leave. And she said, you need to come and stay with me. And I got up from work, went to the police station. And in Toronto, the main police station, the victim services unit is in the station. And the officer who was at the desk was female, thank goodness, and told me, wait a minute. She went and got someone from victim services, and they talked to me about how I can get out safely. And in the book, I have all of the tips. I asked the executive director of victim services if I can put all of their safety tips in the book, and they gave me permission to put them in the book, because there are lots of things I had to do to safeguard myself. And the first thing was not even telegraphing to him that I was leaving. So it meant just taking things gradually out of the house, taking them to work, until eventually my lawyer just sent a letter to him by courier. The day I left for work that morning, and I never came back. Till 3 days later, I came back with the police to get some of my clothes.
Oh.
So sometimes you have to take drastic measures, but it got to a point where it took me 6 months. And that's one of the things in the book I want women to understand is, if you determine that you are being emotionally abused and you have to leave, you can't just leave. You have to make a plan. It took me 6 months to decide and to get things in order before I could leave. And those 6 months were excruciating. And eventually I did leave. But it was still hard because I was leaving behind what was familiar, going to the unknown.
That's always hard to do.
Very hard to do.
Even if it's a bad situation, it's familiar, so you're
Exactly.
you're used to that.
Yeah.
The unfamiliar is scary.
Right. And that's why women go back into emotionally abusive relationships because
hmm
it's not that they're comfortable, but it's what they know.
Yeah, and now you said this was after your third one.
Yeah.
Yeah, and how were you able to get out of the other two? Did you have to kind of plan that out as well?
The first one, I think all three of them, I just left. I left. The first one, I was quite young. The second one was 17 and a half years. And that was quite amicable. Well, I wouldn't say amicable, but there was no fight about me leaving. I just determined that, yeah, I have to leave this relationship.
So were you like aware that like, you know, these relationships are bad for me, but yet because it's what you were, used to, like you just found yourself just getting into another one?
Yeah. And it was after this third one, I started saying to myself,
Something changed there.
yeah, what is it about me that's attracting these emotionally abusive men? So I had to do a lot of deep thinking and peeling off layers about myself. Not very pretty, but I had to really go inside and figure it out. And all of it happened because I was I had signed up for a course called the Year of Miracles with Marcy Shimoff and Deborah Poneman. It was a whole year program. And every month we had a different theme. And I think it was about March or April. The theme was letting go and making space. And I'm thinking to myself, what do I need to let go and make space for? And I realized it was the anger at myself for getting into these relationships. And it started from there. And I started to do a lot of work within myself to figure out what on earth was happening to you. You didn't grow up in an abusive relationship, a family. Why are you attracting these men? And that's how I started figuring it out. And I just woke up one morning and decided to put words down. I had never intended to write a book. I just wanted to get my thoughts on paper. And I woke up with the A to Z of abuse. And that's where the symptoms came from. I had a letter, every letter of the alphabet, I had a narrative. So A is anger, B is belief, F is fear, P is power. So for each one, I had a narrative, and I just started writing. And then I realized these are things that are coming to me, but I'm sure they could help other people as well. And it kind of blossomed from there. And I thought, well, you can't write a book that's all negative. You've got to have something that's positive for people to look forward to. And then I got into this 12 steps of the things that I had to do as I was getting out of it. What do I need to do to help build myself back up? And there were things like paying attention to my subconscious mind, the things I was thinking about, because you are what you think. Looking at starting to love myself, because by the time you're out of in an emotionally abusive relationship, you don't like yourself a lot because you're beating up on yourself saying, why did you do that? That was dumb.
Yeah, you start abusing yourself.
Exactly. And I had to learn to stop that.
Mm-hmm.
And also looking at my intuition, looking at nurturing myself, because we don't nurture ourselves. We nurture other people, but we don't nurture ourselves. And started to visualize using creative visualization to picture what a new life would be like without being emotionally abused. What's this new world going to be like? And what do I need to do to get there?
I love that.
So that's what I started working on.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt other women could learn from some of my own experiences. And that's how the book came about. It didn't intend to be a book. It never started out to be a book. It just started out for me to get my thoughts on paper for me. and then it blossomed. And I have a
I've heard that
workbook
so many times from
to,
people. You know, they didn't intend for it to be a book.
no, no. And then I've got a workbook at the end of it, so to help people to write. And for every section of the book, there's a part that they can write about to help themselves.
Now,
So,
as you were, beginning to heal, did you find that you had to like go back to, these beliefs that you had from childhood and kind of, look at those and address those, the ones where you felt like, you needed to be perfect or you needed to please people?
oh, yes, definitely. And the first is looking at all the limiting beliefs that have really shackled me as an adult. And not feeling that I'm going to disappoint someone because I do something quite differently. So at this point in my life, I've decided I need to think of me first. And I don't think of it me first as in a negative way or being selfish, but in a way that I count, I matter. So I have to take responsibility for my own happiness. I can't expect it to be always giving. I need to learn to receive, and a lot of that receiving I have to give to myself to begin with, because I never did that. And I think most of us don't. We don't know what it feels like to receive anything.
Yeah.
Because we're always giving. And think of the times somebody has said to you, you did something well, or they make a compliment and we say something to negate it.
Mm-hmm.
We don't really accept it.
We can't accept it. No.
No, that's hard.
It takes time.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of practice.
Yeah. So I've learned that I've spent a lot of time the last couple of years really looking inward and taking courses, following people on the internet, learning a lot about what it means to be a whole woman. Because when you're in an abusive relationship, you're broken. And I've learned how now to fix myself, because I have to do the fixing. Nobody else can do the fixing for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So,
it sounds like, you're just taking your life back and figuring out, who you really are and being able to be that person now.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, no, that's great. How long were you in the abusive relationships for, like all total?
I think it was 26 years.
It's a long time.
Yeah, a long time, over a period of time, yeah.
But hey, here you are, you're, even after all that time, you're still able to find yourself again,
Yeah, and my favorite quote is George Eliot, and I started the book with it, is it's never too late to be what you might have been.
Mm-hmm.
My favorite
Great quote.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the other quote that I end the book with, and I love, which is kind of, for me, bookends, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. And that's by Admiral Farragut in the US Civil War. Because it doesn't matter now what people are saying to you, you just need to forge ahead and make a plan, do what you want to do. And this is how I am going to get where I need to be as a human being. Not what I need to do for other people, but this is what I need to do for me. And the other thing I think of too is when you're in a plane, the instructions come what you should do if there's an emergency and the mask drops out of from above you.
Mm-hmm.
What do they tell you to do?
Yeah, you've got to put it on yourself first.
Exactly. Then you
Otherwise,
put it on your child.
You can't help anyone else.
Right. You can't help anybody else. So I've taken that to heart. I need to help myself first, because if I don't help myself, I can't help anybody else. And looking at if there's a relationship in the future, not to be attracting that same kind of person.
Right, you have to break that pattern.
Exactly. So it's learning really how to nurture myself, how to love myself, and not feel uncomfortable doing that. Because it'll take a while for women to learn how not to be uncomfortable putting themselves first,
And
because
I
we've never been
imagine
taught
like,
that.
yeah, and I imagine like as you're doing that, then you're going to become someone who's less likely to attract that type of relationship again.
Exactly. That's for sure.
Mhm.
But you got to do the work.
Mhm.
You've got to do the work on yourself, because if you don't, you end up back in the same place you were when you first started,
Mhm.
back in the same types of relationships, accepting the same kind of men and attracting the same kind of men.
So I guess it all kind of starts with just awareness, right? And recognizing that
Mm-hmm.
you're in this relationship that's not good for you.
Hmm. That's right. And that's why the book is structured the way it is, with starting off with the symptoms, so that women can go through them and say and ask themselves if any of these symptoms apply to me, because some of them apply to the guy and some or your partner, and some apply to you. And so something like belief, you start to believe everything this person tells you, or captive, you feel that you're captive, or you're terrified. That's usually you, because there's no monster under the bed like you're taught when you're wait not when you're taught, but you think of when you're a child. As kids, you say, oh, there's a monster under my bed. He's not under the bed, he's in your house, he's in your life, and he's in your head. So it's lots of things you have to understand and sort out to realize what it is to be emotionally abused.
Hmm. And I know that you've written the book for adults, but can someone, who's maybe going through this as, say a teenager, and they're finding themselves getting into abusive relationships, or they're just being emotionally abused in some other way. I mean, can it be relevant to them as well?
Yes, it can. It's even you're right about it being geared to adults. And one of the things I would like is to go into a lot more detail with a book for younger women. But it's a good start for women to, especially late teens, early 20s, like beginning university, where
Hmm.
you're vulnerable, to read it and start paying attention, especially if you only read the symptoms part, paying attention to the kinds of things that are relevant when it comes to determining whether or not you are experiencing emotional abuse, because it's the knowing that starts it all. You have to know what you're facing. If you don't know, you can't deal with it.
Yeah, and the sooner you can recognize it and get out of it, I mean, the better off you're going to be.
Yeah, that's the thing. And I realized too that the book is not a coffee table book. It's not the kind of book that people would have lying around. So for me, it's the more I can talk about it, the more I can get people start thinking about it and starting their own conversations about it. That's, to me, that's really helpful, because it's you won't see it on anybody's coffee table.
Yeah. Um,
One of the things too I want to do to help women, because my whole idea is to help women, as I said earlier, putting everything down to give women some ideas of what to look for and how to help themselves heal. The other thing I'm doing is I'm taking a coaching certification course on conscious uncoupling with Catherine Woodward Thomas, and that will give me the tools to really work with women to help them through the trauma of getting out of an emotionally abusive relationship.
that's great. Now, I know you also, you've written this book for women, but I mean, we were talking about before we started recording that, I mean,
Yeah.
of course, this can happen to men as well. It can
Mm-hmm.
happen in homosexual relationships. So,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the thing that's really troubling is it's no respecter of persons. It happens to everyone in any level of society and in any type of relationship. What's sad is people who are older, like elderly people who are being abused by their caregivers. And what do you do then? There's nothing you can do because you depend on that person.
Mm.
Or what do you do if you're a woman who is depending on the guy for money? What do you do if you are, say, an immigrant and you're depending on him to get your papers? What do? You put up with it because in your mind there's nothing else I can do, and you don't talk about it to anybody, which is really hard. And those people are the ones that I feel the most for, because they're so vulnerable and there's nobody to help them.
So what do they do? Reach out to someone? Try to reach out to someone?
It's hard to reach out. If you're disabled, you can't. I shouldn't say you can't, but how do you? Because if your caregiver is the person who's abusing you, I don't know what you do.
Yeah.
Especially if you're in a wheelchair, or you're bound to a wheelchair, you can't. You depend on that person, and that's really hard.
Yeah, it's sad.
Yeah, it's such. That's why it's so insidious, because you don't see it, and we tend to only believe things that we see. You say to someone, he's abusing me, he's emotionally abusing me, and they're looking for something on the outside, and there's nothing for them to see. That's why it's so sad.
Yeah. Well, I think it's great that you've written this book and you're trying to bring more awareness to it, and hopefully people will find it and read it and feel less alone.
Yes, that's my goal. I would think that a lot of it will most likely end up being by word of mouth. I have a website and I have a Facebook page, but so I'm hoping that people spread the word, because that's how other people will get to know about it, or at least start talking about the issue of emotional abuse. That's the thing. Because the press talks about physical and sexual. They don't talk about emotional abuse. Nobody's talking about it. So I want to have that conversation started, or at least brought to the surface, let's say. Yeah, that's my aim in life, and the whole purpose. That's what I intend to do going forward, is to get on the speaking circuit and help women to recognize what they're getting into, or what they are into.
No,
because the book can always also be for people to look at it and say, oh, now I know what the symptoms are, that's something I need to avoid. Yeah, so it's twofold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Carol Ann, tell us, how you're doing today.
I'm doing fine.
Yeah. Are there any things that, you still kind of struggle with?
Yeah, I do. It's here in Canada, we have a very strange, I shouldn't say strange. The divorce laws here were set up in many respects to protect women whose husbands left them or partners left them with nothing. And there's a grid that they have that you have to pay if you go to court. So my ex took me to court, and I have to pay him every month because I make more money than he does.
Oh, wow.
So that's painful, because I feel he's being rewarded for bad behavior.
Right.
But he took me to court, and once it gets into the court system, there was nothing I could do about it. So I just look at it. I try not to let it bother me a lot. I look at it as a gift, because without him, I would not be talking to you. I would not have written a book. I would have nothing to say. So in many respects, that's how I start looking at it. Not as hating him or tying myself up in knots. I try to find something positive about it and move on. But I'm okay. I'm working full time, and I'm fine. I'm doing okay.
Yeah. And tell us about, what it is that you do today.
I work for the Ontario government in the human rights area. So my unit, we listen to people who are complaining about being harassed or discriminated against. And it's only within the Ontario Public Service because there are about 64,000 people in the Ontario Public Service. So my unit deals with those complaints. I'm a team lead.
Nice.
And I have advisors who report to me who deal with the complaints. So, yeah, well, that's what I do on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
For the moment, I should say.
Yes, you have even bigger plans for yourself.
I do. I do.
That's great. So I want to ask you the final question that I have for you today. And that is, given what you know now, if you could go back to when you were going through your tough times and give yourself one piece of advice, what would it be?
Listen to my intuition. My intuition all along kept telling me, especially in this last relationship, do not get involved with this person. And I allowed myself to be coerced, and I lived to regret it because the signs were there. And that's something that we don't pay attention to. Most women, we don't pay attention to our intuition. We ignore it. And the signs were there. The little red flags were going up early on. And I ignored it. And I've lived to pay the price. So that's the main thing I said to myself. From now on, when my gut says don't do something or do something, I'll listen to my gut.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, that's it.
Yeah, it can be so important to do that. But I think, we lose sense of our intuition, or we lose our ability to trust it sometimes after we go through these things.
That's true.
Right?
That's true.
And we have to kind of find our way back to trusting it again.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. For sure.
Yeah.
Because it's your intuition is there for a reason. It's there to steer you. And it never, ever steers you in the wrong direction. Because I look back over my life, and the times that I have not paid attention to my intuition are the times when I've hurt the most.
Mm.
The times when my intuition has said, do something, and I've done it, I felt fabulous.
Yeah.
Like my intuition in January said, you need to go to Machu Picchu because a friend of mine was going and hike the Inca Trail. And I did that in August.
Oh, nice.
And I loved it. Another time my intuition said, go off to Japan and teach. I went off and I lived there for 2.5 years, loved it. Didn't even think twice about it. I made the decision and I was gone in 3 months.
I love it. Sometimes, yeah, we have to lean into that fear. It might seem scary at first, but it ends up being such an incredible experience.
Right. It's like Susan Jeffers says, feel the fear and do it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, but that's the main thing for me is my intuition. Just listen to it. And I think that's something that women need to do more. There's something else, we call it woman's sense or something like that. But we need to pay attention to our intuition because we don't.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I know you mentioned you have a website and Facebook page, I believe.
Yes.
How can people find those?
My website is carolannemarshall.com and my Facebook page is Carol Ann Marshall.
Okay,
so
great.
It's pretty easy.
Yep. Well, I'll have them linked up on your show notes page as well.
Thanks. Thank you.
So
it's been such a treat talking to you. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, I'm glad that we got connected, and thanks for coming on the show and for sharing your story and the lessons that you learned along the way, and just spreading this message that definitely is an important one, and I'm happy to help you share with the listeners here today. So thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and it's been a pleasure.
All right. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks. I will, and you too.
Thanks for listening to the show today. This has been the Grass Gets Greener podcast, episode 120. Go to thegrassgetsgreener.com/Carol Ann Marshall, and that's without any dashes, so just Carol Ann Marshall. to find the links mentioned during this episode or to leave a comment. So I hope you enjoyed this episode and were able to take something away from it. If you're someone who is experiencing emotional abuse, or you have in the past and you're still affected by it, then I hope that Carol Ann's story and message has given you some hope today. Carol Ann spent 26 years of her life going through this, and here she is today taking her life back. So know that that's possible for you too. And please share this with anyone who you know who you think could benefit from it, and let's help Carol Ann spread her story and message. And come back in 2 weeks for the next episode. I'm not sure who that's going to be with just yet, but do come back for that. Also, head over to the website to grab your free copy of the Top 10 Strategies Guide for Survivors. In it, you'll find the top 10 most common strategies my podcast guests have used for overcoming the effects of past trauma. It's a great place to get started if you're looking for some strategies that can help you in your healing, as they have helped my guests. And you can find that at thegrassgetsgreener.com/guide, or also on the show notes page. So be sure to grab that if you haven't yet. And lastly, don't forget to head over to iTunes or Stitcher to leave the show a rating and review so that we can reach as many survivors as possible. And, as always, have hope.